everybody. Jerry McHugh Jr. here with San Juan Resources for this month's San Juan IQ. This month we have a fabulous guest, John Harpole from Mercator Energy. He's founder president and has a wealth of experience in the natural gas and oil business. Moves a lot of gas. We'll hear him introduce himself here shortly. So, John, we talked a little bit beforehand. I was remembering how you were an Evans Scholar at the University of Colorado, and we were talking about some of our colleagues in the same cohort about that time who I remember from going to high school with them or junior high, the Morrises and some of those folks. But I don't know, I just thought that was a great story. And University of Colorado and the Evans Eisenhower Scholars are really a great program. So talk a little bit about that.
If some of your listeners are not aware of the Evans Scholarship, I'm sure they've seen the movie Caddyshack, where the focal point was the young Danny Noonan that was trying to get the Caddy Scholarship. Well, that actually is a real thing. Bill Murray, who was in that movie Caddyshack, his brother, I think his older brother, was an Evans Scholar. But essentially, I'd say it could be as many as 60, 70 years ago, a gentleman by the name of Chick Evans contributed his winnings in the U.S. Amateur, I believe it was, to his caddy so his caddy could go to school. And my friends that are more involved in the program day to day could answer this better, but I think it's put 12 to 13,000 kids through college. So when I was 12 years old, my mom said, "John, you've got to go down to Denver Country Club and caddy, you can get a college scholarship." Now, to put that in context, I was the 8th kid out of a big Catholic family of 9 kids. My father had died 6 years before. So mom was trying to figure out how are all these kids going to go to college, because the presumption was that we would. And so I caddied at DCC for 6 years, got the scholarship, got up to CU Boulder, met, some of these friends of ours, Jerry, that you mentioned, we've known for, since college. The Solich brothers, George Solich, Jeff Solich, Tim Morris, Drew Morris, who I knew from Denver Country Club days, Frank Nessinger. And the tough part is, if you measure yourself against the success of the Solich brothers, you didn't do very well, because they've hit several Grand Slam home runs.
And
have become great leaders in this industry and very prolific donors to a number of different causes. George, especially to that Evans Scholarship. So it was just a great leg up. I graduated from college with no debt. I learned about the mineral land management program up at CU Boulder, got into the oil and gas business so that I could stay here in Denver, and just forever thankful for it.
Well, that's quite a thing. So thanks for talking about that. And it does show just how important education is, and how it's benefited all you guys. Especially great to know you guys too.
Well, I think, and I swear, back in those days, I think I met your father. I'm not sure how much he played golf, but I know he was definitely around the club. So
right. He usually had me working. He didn't want me to run that place. I was off doing stuff.
That's why you have grit today.
That's why I'm right here.
You weren't lazing around by the pool.
That's right. So
thank you again for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. So a lot has changed in the last year and a half since COVID. John, talk about yourself, and we'll kind of outline the discussion we're going to talk about here for today.
So I've had Mercator. Next year, it will be our 30th year. Mercator Energy is a natural gas brokerage company. Got 4 amazing employees. We manage now, I think, near 2.5 billion cubic feet of gas per day. To give it perspective, the U.S. produces about 95. So we see a lot of gas. We're not a natural gas marketer in the sense that we've never bought gas and resold it. What we do is sell our services to a producer to show them how to nominate, schedule, balance, and account for their natural gas. We find markets for their natural gas. But in addition to that, we help companies like large ammonia plants buy natural gas down on the Gulf Coast. So we have quite an interesting perspective, anywhere from Louisiana Gulf Coast to California, in terms of end users and producers. The majority of our producers are in the Rocky Mountains. And so we've seen quite a cycle of, 20 years ago when there wasn't enough pipeline capacity to get gas out, to today where a huge pipeline that moves gas out of the Rockies, Ruby Pipeline, declared bankruptcy ostensibly because there wasn't enough producer volume of production and producer commitment to pipeline capacity to really make a go of it for Ruby Pipeline. So we've seen quite a cycle of, I guess you'd say, boom and bust, and different reactions to those different cycles. So, Jerry, when I get upside down now, my head doesn't even turn blue anymore. So, just so used to it. So, but I've had an interesting career and very thankful to work in an industry that creates wealth, and that's what oil and gas does. So,
well, I think many of us are very grateful for our energy, our careers, colleagues we've known in the business especially. And I think we're, I like today, front page of the paper, the Europeans are going to say they're going to stop buying Russian oil.
yes.
They're making all these grand statements that no more pipeline Russian gas. Are we in an energy crunch now, or are we approaching a crisis? How would you describe things?
Well, the Europeans walked into this willingly, the position they're in right now. And I referred to it several times as a trap that Vladimir Putin has been working to put in place for over 20 years. Some people think 40 years in terms of the larger Soviet Union. But the Europeans made three large mistakes. They have an under-reliance on hydrocarbons, an over-reliance on renewable energy, and then they shut down their nuclear and their coal facilities prematurely. I was going to say immaturely. I think it probably is immature also, but they prematurely shut those down, and then found themselves on the long end of a tether of supply related to Russian supply. Gas that I think really honestly one of the craziest things I've heard is that right now today there are 3 pipelines that go across Ukraine, natural gas pipelines, that are currently moving Russian natural gas through Ukraine to other countries, and Russia is still paying Ukraine the transit fee for that natural gas to go to Western Europe. That's how tenuous it is. You would have heard an embargo on Russian natural gas if that embargo didn't cause more damage to the Europeans than it did Russia. Germany is so, as one isolated country, is so critically reliant on natural gas that if that gas was not moving through Ukraine and through a couple of other pipeline corridors through Europe, Germany would be rationing natural gas to residential users right now. But the fact that, so in eastern Ukraine, 3 different compressor stations are under the control of Russian troops. But when the Russian troops tried to move into the compressor stations to run them, Naftogaz, which is the Ukrainian pipeline gas company, said, look, if they move in, they don't know how to run it, we'll turn off all natural gas. But I mean, think about that. These are 2 countries at war. The European Union is certainly on the side of Ukraine, but that critical supply of natural gas is still flowing. And 2 of the banks that effectuate the transfers of money from the European utilities to Gazprom, the natural gas supplier in Russia, 2 of those banks were not subject to those SWIFT payment requirements. So Putin really has Europe on the, as I said, has Europe by the short hairs. They're in trouble. And I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think they can supplant that natural gas coming into Ukraine from Russia to Europe. I don't think they can supplant that for 2 winters. And I think that's why you see so much strength in the current price of natural gas in the US and certainly overseas. We looked at this, I looked it up right before we got on air, and the current price for natural gas, the NYMEX Henry Hub today, traded at $8.73, 8.74 cents. The NYMEX or that NYMEX price, Henry Hub was $8.74. In Europe, the value of natural gas landed LNG wise at TTF Dutch Harbor traded at $32. And I think, and I'm going on and on and on here, Jerry, but the 3-year price for natural gas in Europe is over $21 per MMBTU. The 3-year price here in the US is probably trading below $5. But the length of the strength of this gas price is one that I still don't think we've seen the highs yet, either in certainly in Europe or here. And a lot of this came on before Putin attacked Ukraine. And December 22nd, the price of natural gas was $62. The price for natural gas was so high in Europe in the last fall that all of the ammonia plants that turn natural gas into ammonia and then into fertilizer shut down. And so one of the horrible outcomes of this whole thing will be famine in Africa, perhaps even in parts of India, because they can't get the grain that they would typically get from Russia, Ukraine, and from Europe. So the reverberation of what's going on right now is going to go much longer than the price spikes that we've seen that were related to weather events in the last 10 years here in the U.S. We've reached a new level, and I think we'll stay there for quite some time.
It's amazing, and like you said, it was happening before the Ukraine invasion.
Yes,
it was happening in, even in the fall. I mean, I remember seeing those prices because the wind wasn't blowing in Northern Europe. They had to pull on more gas. Prices went up. And I mean, to our credit, we've kind of been separated from Europe, but it seems like we're somehow being affected a little bit more now on the price, because maybe more volumes are going out. I mean, there's only a certain amount of LNG that can leave, which is about 12 to 15%.
I think that one of the other factors that Europe missed the boat on, no pun intended, is that they unilaterally, 7 different countries put in place hydraulic fracturing moratoriums or outright bans. I totaled up the populations of those 7 countries. You're talking about countries like Germany, Italy, Spain, Bulgaria, Ireland. 7 of those countries, and they're not all necessarily EU countries, but they're European countries. Total population is 320 million people. And yet, even though that the Europe is on a war footing with Russia right now, none of those countries have lifted their fracking bans. Had they pursued hydraulic fracturing the way we did here in the US, they'd be energy independent. Their own European natural gas production in the last 10 years has dropped off 50%. And so this thing has all happened during this notion of an energy transition that I just don't believe can happen, physically can't happen. And again, the people that will pay the highest price for this are the low and middle income folks who are going to see their energy costs go up and their food costs go up. So it's very worrisome and very frightening to me what's going on here. So self-inflicted by the Europeans, though.
Well, one, to me, I was thinking, we talk about energy transitions, and you're seeing even, with real energy, I'm talking hydrocarbons, you're seeing a hydrocarbon transition in Europe. They're getting away from a certain supply of hydrocarbons. So what do we call that? This is also an energy transition, which is probably going to take a while.
I heard Chris Wright, the founder of Liberty, the hydraulic fracturing company. Chris Wright spoke at a deal that we were at on Tuesday, and Chris's number was that we've spent, Jerry, you can help me here. I think he said the world has spent $77 trillion on this energy transition, and yet we've only seen a 5% decline in overall hydrocarbon use from 83% to 78%. He said, and so what we've really done with that $7 trillion is cherry pick the low hanging fruit. Chris is adamant that this political promise of an energy transition that's founded perhaps on policymakers' response to propaganda from NGOs, it's not going to happen. It physically cannot happen. It physically can't happen just from the standpoint you would need utility scale battery storage. You need utility scale battery storage in order to see this transition happen. And yet, if you took 500 years of production from Tesla's battery factory out of Nevada, 500 years of their current production level wouldn't hold 1 day's of US electricity usage. And so again, people just don't understand the scale of this thing. Politicians make the promise that we're going to transition to 100% renewables. It can't happen. You're going to see some issues this weekend because of the heating load down in Texas. You'll see some ERCOT-like issues this weekend. You cannot get rid of hydrocarbons until you have utility scale storage of electricity. And we're as far away from that, I think, as from curing cancer. So.
Well, when I think of the transition too, I think of the Europeans and them transitioning from Russian gas to, I would call it freedom gas.
Yes.
Russian oil to freedom oil. I mean, I'm not sure the Saudis could really be categorized as freedom oil, but they're not Russian. Gutter probably even more so would be more freedom oil. But I mean, that's got to be a tough thing for them. And like, what's going to happen to manufacturing in Europe? I mean, are they going to even be able to manufacture? I know fertilizer, ammonia, and nitrogen shut down. What about the plants that make widgets and what make high profile, highly technical items? Are those shutting down as well?
And it may not even be that technical as much as basic items like steel. I was at a breakfast this morning with a friend that builds high rises. And he said they can't get steel right now. That plant that was attacked, the steel plant Mariupol, supplied a lot of steel to Europe, but it's tough to manufacture steel in a good environment. I can't imagine what it's like under war-like conditions, but you're going to have a shortage of steel, you're going to have a shortage of aluminum. You'll see all sorts of supply chain issues that are playing out. That's like a great catch-all for hey, we can't manufacture this right now because our input cost is too high. I was in eastern Colorado and western Kansas 3 or 4 months ago. I stopped by a friend's shop, a John Deere shop, and I was warning him about the high cost of fertilizer. He said, John, it's already here. But at that point in time, the wheat prices going forward had not responded. But there was a lot of winter wheat that was not planted this year because the fertilizer cost was higher than anything they expected they could get for that crop of wheat. And so you're going to see, all this inflation. I think our friend Tom Petrie calls it stagflation. Look up that definition, but it's just not good. And I think there's going to be a very, very clear understanding for a lot of people that have been on the fence about how important energy is and how important hydrocarbon is to that mix, so that the rude awakening is this energy transition that they all would like to recognize cannot physically happen overnight. Just can't.
Well, and you see our government and even European governments doubling down on renewables just because of the war, which is like idiot. I mean, I don't understand it.
It's shameful. It's hypocritical. Germany has committed to 2 LNG plants because they didn't really have any. But in my nightmare scenario here, so let's say, what's the pinch point for energy? Well, right now it's pipelines through Ukraine into Western Europe. Well, the solution at one point in time, I heard in January, or it was February, there were 26 LNG cargoes headed across the Atlantic to Europe. Imagine each one of those holds 3 billion cubic feet of gas. That 3 BCF is enough to heat 40,000 homes for a year. Well, it was good old US shale revolution gas that saved Europe. Russia was sending 30% less natural gas in September, October, November, and December than they had historically. So given the dearth of wind in the North Sea and the demand for natural gas and for coal, it was difficult to keep the storage fields in Europe, the limited number of storage fields, full. So we're going to see this summer influx of natural gas into Europe to rebuild their storage position. But, there's also another play that I'm concerned about. And I think China, and to a lesser extent, Japan, may start bidding out those LNG delivered prices to Europe. So play through that chess game. If China does that, guess who they help by bidding out, by by winning the bid for LNG cargoes that are flexible coming to China, which means less LNG to Europe, which makes Europe more reliant on Russian gas. I think the other play that we'll probably see in a year or two is that and this is horrible, but I think if NATO does something to provoke Russia, they will likely take out one of those liquefaction facilities in Europe. The one that I'm most worried about is the one in Poland. And I don't know what NATO's measured response will be to something like that. Because if they took out Russian natural gas, you have people freezing to death in the winter. So I think from a military standpoint, the US should be doing everything that it can to protect all of those LNG receipt facilities that I'd say 15 to 16 of the 28 in Europe are hypercritical. Should we go put, volunteer to install an Iron Dome kind of protection system? But this whole notion of natural gas as a weapon, that part of the chess game that Putin is playing has not been played fully yet. So.
Well, to me, that's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. I had always wondered about them wanting to take out some of those facilities just because. Why do you want your enemies? And it's really against NATO more than anything.
So imagine if you took them all out, 12% of the natural gas that we're exporting right now wouldn't have the same market. And the only market might be Asia, which benefits China, which benefits the China-Russia relationship. So I call it, my poor name for that is the LNG diplomacy that's going on right now may suffer a Pearl Harbor-like event. And Germany can't even talk about how reliant they are on natural gas, but it's amazing that natural gas is still flowing. Ukrainian-Russian relationship, contractual relationship is still going. And I don't know, Jerry, I don't know what is it going to take to wake up the world that this energy transition is going to be extremely painful and perhaps impossible. So
let's pivot to the United States. Our commander-in-chief has promised copious amounts of LNG to Europe, said we're going to supply it. I mean, those of us in our business over here go like, okay, a lot of this LNG is under contract, notwithstanding that.
But he doesn't have unilateral authority to renegotiate any kind of arm's length transaction between capitalists here in the US and Europe. The notion of that and the fact that a lot of Americans probably believe it is just crazy. And I'm sure the Asians and the Chinese are laughing at that notion. I think that gas will go, that is able to swing, that's not tied to a long-term contract. That gas will go to the highest bidder, period. In the meantime, so here's a story that I share with others. So on February 11th, the head of the European Energy, the head EU commissioner for energy came to the US for a meeting, the 9th annual meeting between EU and US energy technocrats, let's say. She thanked the US profusely for our LNG supply, for our shale gas reserves. 5 days later, the Biden administration's appointee to the FERC chairmanship, Richard Glick, announced that for the first time in 23 years, they were going to add 2 new issues to the permitting process for pipelines. And those two new issues dealt with, you're going to have to go prove that you're effectively net zero and prove to the climate change activists that you're installing and building this gas pipeline would benefit the world, not just.
These are European standards, right? They're
European
not American
standards.
standards. They're
No, they're European
standards.
standards for, very good point, inflicted on all of the pipelines here in the US. So this is 5 days after the EU recognized how critically important LNG was. At that same time, the Secretary of DOE was holding 6 permits that would allow existing LNG plants, either new or existing, to build additional LNG trains. They were holding those. Well, there was such a furor from Congress at the announcement by FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that this was going to happen, that they did pull back those 2 new regulations. The Biden administration did, but you know, it's clear to anyone that's listened to any of his early press announcements or press conferences that he's opposed to hydrocarbons, that he's really bent over to the far left of the Democratic Party. And so, you know, you want to talk about how much of that is built into that $8.74 price today. It's the uncertainty that the US government creates on this that creates power for Putin. And we could speak very, very loudly right now in terms of our commitment to LNG and our commitment to our European allies, but I don't see that communication happening.
Let's get to the ground. I mean, I looked at your interview on Hard Energy and with Robert Bryce. You talked about Western Colorado being able to supply a huge amount of natural gas to LNG terminals to export. In the San Juan Basin, we have 120 trillion cubic feet of gas just in our Mancos alone. We just kind of scratched the surface a little bit on that.
We've got world-class reserves in the Rockies.
Yeah.
World-class kind of reserves. And
What
yet
does this mean to the world?
we've got the states of Washington, Oregon, and California that would do everything they can to keep an LNG export facility from being built in their states. So what we've done, thanks to state politics and federal politics, is kept the conventional play in the Piceance Basin, the Mancos play in the shale play in the Piceance Basin, the Niobrara and the San Juan, who kept all those world-class reserves from being developed. That you and I both know that if we could get those reserves, if we could get access for those reserves through pipeline and LNG export facilities on the West Coast, we would be extremely cost competitive with any Russian gas that might be piped 3,000 miles to China. And if we were exporting that natural gas, it would more than likely be offsetting coal-fired electric generation, which reduces the CO2 footprint by 50 to 60%. I mean, it's this not in my backyard politics that are really getting in the way of real climate change type CO2 reduction solutions. All because I really think a subset of those climate change activists just hate hydrocarbon producers, just pure and simple hate it. I mean, there are 44 municipalities in California that have banned methane, so natural gas, from being connected to new build residential and commercial households.
Well, we have that in Denver here too, don't we?
That's our great governor. We've got 0.2% of the CO2 emissions in the world here in Colorado, and yet we're embarking on this program that I think is just presidential propaganda fodder for our Governor Polis, that really he's destroying an oil and gas industry in Colorado unilaterally, all on the altar of climate change, when the net effect is 0.2% if we just stop doing what we're doing in Colorado. We should be looked at as a solution to that and not a impediment to it. So
I don't know, and I think when this all clears out, I think this climate change policy and the directions we've gone might turn out to be one of the largest hoaxes in the world.
I
All
heard
for
it.
government control, all
Right.
for government telling people what to do. It has larger ramifications. I mean, the list of bad things in the world, climate change, I mean, on many people's lists, is probably number 13 or 15 or something. But I mean,
Well,
number one, I mean, Russia,
shouldn't-
China, all these countries are laughing their heads off at us.
I
And by
agree.
the way, Russia, you know, you've talked about how Russia funded the green movements in Europe, and that they fund the anti-fracking here in the United States through the environmental NGOs.
So at the very least, we were both a little chagrined at the fact that the Europeans are now very, very willing to accept hydraulic fractured gas. It's the
Yeah,
only
happened
thing that's gonna
yesterday
get
with
them through this.
France. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the only thing that gets them through this. So, but I did hear a speaker that when the obvious issues with renewable energy come to the forefront in terms of the cost to residential consumers of electricity, that 25, 30 years from now, as you drive to Missouri from Colorado, you'll look at those wind turbines that are still standing and they'll be an embarrassment. They'll be an embarrassment. I mean, we know, you know, if you want all renewable, all wind, all solar, you got to increase mining by 500%. But more importantly, you've got to rely on Chinese critical minerals in order to even do it, put it together. So 65% of the polysilica in the world comes out of China, and the vast majority of that comes out of the Uyghur region, where they have slave labor camps that are producing the polysilica. So I think I shared with you, I've got a son, two daughters that go to a Catholic college, and the monastery was considering putting in solar panels. So I sent them all the information related to what is the moral equivalent of blood diamonds. I mean, do you really want to support an industry that looks to slave labor for its cheap solar panels? They were completely unaware of it, but I said, I'll pay for it. I'll endorse this. I'll support it. If you can prove that polysilica through your solar panel provider did not come from the Uyghur region, and ultimately they found out they couldn't. So fortunately for now, I think that concept, that notion is dead. You know, another good friend of ours, Patty Limerick, once said that people have to give you permission to teach them. You know, you and I know that if we sat down with somebody long enough and they listened, we could discuss the physics of all of this and the practicality and the scale of it, and maybe win their hearts and minds. But Jerry, there are a lot of people right now that are on a mission, on this climate change catastrophe mission, that won't listen to logic. That logic somehow is going to be played out for them over the next 15 years, and perhaps a very painful way.
Well, I mean, already natural gas is being touted by the smart money as being a fabulous solution. Where we've worked and where we currently work, we know what's going on. At least our company, others in our basin are. I mean, I call it a new track and field event called the regulatory hurdles.
Oh yeah.
So we're working a lot on getting over those hurdles and pushing on, because we have some valuable assets that are what we think can contribute. Of course, there's profit motive involved, and we do that. But it's not an overnight get quick rich scheme that I'm involved in, for sure. But states, the federal government, not all states, certain states, and the federal government are doing what they can to thwart this, while promising Europe and the world that we'll be there with your LNG. So,
Right. It's
ironic.
At the least hypocritical, at the most it's an outright bald-faced lie. We think, I was again at dinner last night, a gentleman that's expert in all these things, he's a producer, a new dear friend, said that California is essentially 5 years behind Germany and some of the more radical countries that were pursuing this all renewable all the time. And the question, he said, will they learn from Germany's lesson? There are still elements, the German energy minister won't allow for any kind of moratorium on fracking to be canceled. Doesn't want to see drilling in Germany. They have committed to 2 LNG plants, but you still have people protesting and questioning the commitment to LNG facilities and infrastructure that might be around for 30 years, they said. Well, they better pray that it's around for 30 years and that it's not ultimately attacked by Russia. So,
Well, there's been talk about a U.S. Marshall Plan for energy security. I mean, we've got to be feeling very good at $8 gas, while the rest of the world in some places are paying north of $20, $30, $40. Is anybody touting that on a larger scale? I know you had talked about that before in previous discussions. What are your thoughts on that? What can producers do to get behind something like that, John?
I think it's EQT, the president of EQT, the producer.
Toby Rice.
Toby Rice has a fascinating PowerPoint out there, I think from one of their last financial presentations, that talks about what we could do for the world. I look at that as a day-to-day mechanical thing, that there's not one U.S. LNG flag tanker because of the Jones Act in the U.S. Unless you manufacture that LNG tanker here in the U.S., can't fly a U.S. flag. Well, I think we ought to amend that any LNG tanker that floats across the Pacific or the Atlantic that has U.S. produced natural gas has a de facto U.S. flag on it, just to send a message. I think we should start securing every delivery point chain in that production from the wellhead to Europe or Asia. We should protect that from a military standpoint. But I think to go to that larger Marshall Plan, that if you really start calculating what natural gas would do, assuming that it displaces coal, I think Robert Bryce said coal usage worldwide increased about 15% last year. And so this notion that we're unilaterally somehow going to go offset the trajectory of CO2 emissions by doing things here in the US is just economic and energy suicide. And I know that $8 is livable as compared certainly to $32, but $8 is going to be such an incredible hardship to low-income energy households here in the US. We're seeing that in Europe. I saw a report even before Christmas that they thought 50 million residential users of gas in Europe wouldn't be able to afford their utility bills. And so I think that this argument about climate change has really been between a lot of liberal elites and other people, and not middle income and low income folks. And certainly I don't think low income folks have the time in their struggle in life to even have an opinion on climate change. And may be wrong. I'm sure there are exceptions that you can come up with. But I think as people see the pain at the pump, the gas pump, and then at the utility bill once a month, you'll see, I hope, an awakening in terms of the impossibility of some kind of magical energy transition by 2030. It can't happen. It can't physically happen.
Well, I get discouraged because the world thinks that oil producers are money grubbers and that we're doing backflips over high prices, and that, oh, this is our chance to get rich. And I mean, most everybody I know in this industry is they want affordable, reliable energy. We want to produce that. My dad used to call it the cheap blue flame because it was cheap, and it was there was no use for natural gas in the 30s and 40s.
Right, it's true.
I like to term the cheap blue flame certifiably green, because I think that, I mean, American natural gas is the most clean it's probably cleaner than solar and wind with all the destruction that they have and the GHG which they put off out there. Our energy is especially clean. I'm sure there's studies to show that.
But
So
more importantly too, it's dispatchable. It's there when you need it. It's there when you need it. Think about the campaign that Putin ran in Europe, where on RT News, Russian television news, there were ads that compared hydraulic frackers to pedophiles. You and I have been in this industry for 30, 40 years. We're used to people throwing rocks at us.
Well, he's calling Ukraine a Nazi country, and and the president's a Jewish guy.
Jewish. No,
And all the people that listen to RTN somehow believe that. There's no credible evidence about that. So,
it's just propaganda.
yeah.
But
yeah.
much of this was in place, much of the price situation, certainly the lack of fertilizer manufacturing in Europe, much of this was in place before Putin's attack. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that all of the blame doesn't fall on Vladimir Putin, but on some of the choices
right.
that were being made in Europe for energy it's just going to be too easy for the folks that want to distract and dissuade to blame Putin when, I look at, isn't Angela Merkel, who ran Germany for a decade, isn't she responsible for the position that Germany's in right now? I hope there's
no doubt.
I hope there's a very curious reflection on all of this by people that otherwise wouldn't. So we'll see.
Okay, so we're or at least San Juan Resources. We're way upstream. We go get the leases. We put a stake in the ground. We're working on getting over our regulatory hurdles to get things ready to drill. And I think there's some good solution to that. That's why I like doing this SJIQ, and I really appreciate you coming today and giving your perspective. We could probably talk for a couple more hours, but I know our time is limited. I hope you come back again. Are there any other thoughts you'd like to leave with, John? Anything you'd like to Marshall Plan, Western Colorado? I mean, what do you see out there with some of your companies that you work with?
Well, I was in China 10 years ago, and they were fracking their 60-second well for hydraulic fracture, horizontal well. So just at the infancy stage of all of that in China. And the country manager for EOG told me that they had every frac truck on location at this one frac. Came back, I called my friend Jim Brown at Halliburton and said, I just discovered a new definition of energy security. How many wells could we frack on any given day in Canada and the US? I called a friend at Schlumberger to check Jim's work, but they both came up with, in the US and Canada, we could frack as many as 400 wells a day, given the frack fleet that had been built out. Now, I asked some experts on that at dinner last night. They said probably 200. But that frack fleet, the people, the human resources, the steel, are my measure of energy security now. And I have clients, I won't say where, that just got a rig, and they said the crew is just not very good. I've got another client, or actually a friend, not a client, that's running a rig, and they can only run it 8 hours because they can't find the people to have 3 shifts working this rig. I think if we had the support of the federal and state governments for a critical energy infrastructure, and we could have not the boom and bust cycles that you and I have lived through, so many we can't count them now, that we could attract the necessary people to this industry that would stay in it and have their kids and grandkids stay in it. Europe faces a really tough problem that even if they waived all their fracking moratoriums, how long would it take to be able to get a scale of workforce together to supplant Russian natural gas, let alone LNG?
Yeah.
So I think we really, really need to look at the human element of all of this and the predictability of all this as a critical energy infrastructure. And I think the thing we always got to be careful about is that when our friends at cocktail parties say, hey, I'm not against fracking, I'm for all of the above. Well, that's what I now call, Jerry, energy relativism, that I'm not an all of the above guy. I mean, what your dad referred to, what's the best solution? Is it that cheap blue flame to make sure households can thrive and don't have to choose in low income households between heating and eating? And so again, if we had a governor that was more knowledgeable about really what we were doing and wasn't, in essence, didn't mistrust the oil and gas industry, we might have, Jerry, I calculate we could have another 14 to 15,000 jobs in Western Colorado, all related to trying to turn down the CO2 emissions of China by exporting natural gas. And it's such a clear vision. I hope that it happens someday, but there's a lot of politics and propaganda that's getting in the way.
Well, it's definitely been one of those tough environments. I've never seen anything like it in our business, and I'm
Right.
sure you haven't either. Notwithstanding that, I mean, I don't know. To me, it's getting the message out, showing how helpful hydrocarbons have been. That it allows people to sit on their couch and play on their phones or watch TV. I mean, if we had to work 400 or 500 years ago, we'd be out in the fields making the energy.
Right.
Coal and then hydrocarbons really, oil and gas have taken away that time. The number of energy workers in the world. Last IQ, we had John Constable on. It used to be 75% of the workers in the world before the Industrial Revolution spent all their time on energy. 75% of the people were working on energy. Now it's just a sliver of that. And look at how much energy we produce and how good our lives are. So, I mean, I'll take a book, a page out of Chris Wright's book where he talks about, instead of trying to beat down the negative 10% to 8%, let's take the 90% of good, which we do in the world, and push that up to 150%, because everyone's looking for us, really.
As Chris said, that should be on the first page of these public reports by these vertically integrated oil and gas companies. They should stop apologizing for their environment and social governance issues, and to really point out that propane in Africa frees more people from slavery, you'd say, slavery to chasing down wood or food. Propane
Right.
does more of that than anybody can imagine. Robert Bryce pointed out that 2.5 billion women still wash clothes by hand.
Amazing.
It's stunning
Yeah.
that we
Well-
can't even turn on the light. So,
Well, I appreciate your time, John. Thank you so much. Hopefully we can talk again, and look forward to seeing you at a impromptu lunch again, hopefully again soon, or maybe we'll plan to meet again soon.
Jerry, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you. Producer focused with a great marketing, natural gas marketing company, Mercator, John Harpole. Again, thank you, and we'll talk to you next time on the IQ.